Hey,
Hi, Alex.
hi
Hello.
Peter. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to see you too. Yeah, lovely.
I know you said that you've been doing some traveling recently. Your more recent events that you've been doing, can you tell me a little bit about that? I'm curious.
Yeah. I mean, I wear different hats really, but the main main work, I call it Rosicrucian work, really. But it involves, of course, the original Rosicrucians that were born in Queen Elizabeth I's time, and then involved Francis Bacon as the leader of it and the whole Shakespeare works and so on. And so there's that side of it. For me, that became the gateway into the whole Rosicrucian story and so on. But I used to be an architect, and but I gave that up to do this full-time teaching and research work.
Yeah,
So the landscape always interested me a lot, and I'm a bit of a seer, so I can see the energies and chakras in the land and so on. And at the time when I was sharing this with people, nobody else ever talked about this sort of thing. So I had to be very discreet.
yeah,
And now it's more widely known. But but the old mystery schools, the Rosicrucians, for instance, and the mystery schools before that, they always worked with the landscape. They had a knowledge of it, and which our modern world has mostly lost. So I had a mission really to bring back that knowledge and teach people how it worked really. And
yeah,
so I take people on a lot of journeys into landscape simply for them to feel and see these things and so on. So, I teach through, well, both through talks and so on, but also by giving people experiences
right,
and getting them to do the work as well.
right.
Doing the right thing, the right place at the right time. And then it's a work of service for the world. So, so I got these different hats. One hat, the landscape and so on, I used to call Zoents, still do call it Zoents. And then the Rosicrucian Bacon hat, that came under the Francis Bacon Research Trust, which I set up as a charity a long time ago, in 1980. So I was urged to do that. And yeah, and then I do various things privately too. So that's an invisible hat.
And on your website, you have these interesting maps of the layout of Great Britain, and you show the the sort of topology of some of these landscape temples that you're talking about, and how there's certain amazing alignments between these sites. So is that kind of where you're aligning the tours and events you do with these key
Yes,
these key sites?
absolutely. I mean, it's taken many years of research. I'm visionary, but also it has to be tested out.
Right,
Actually, all the practical work done and the research done, both in terms of the land, the history, how people have used it in the past and been affected by it, and things like that, and to see if the knowledge existed before, which it did. I found it did, and so so it took quite a number of years really, but now eventually I realized it's all connected with the main mythology of the world. The myths, the great myths of the world that are used in the mystery schools are about the land as well as about people. It's about
right,
how to do the right thing in the right place at the right time with the right orientation, which means the right purpose, as well as which way you're facing and so on. And it's really important. I mean, as an architect, I realize that if you put people in a room that's not fit for the purpose, then they don't do it very well.
right,
The same thing in the environment. If you build a building in the wrong place in the environment, it doesn't function well. And people used to know this. Certain people used to know this in the past and design towns and so on accordingly. But sometimes it's just done intuitively. People had an intuition about it. But in the modern world, that's overridden by all the, other stuff that goes on. So people aren't allowed to use their intuition anymore.
True.
Yeah. So anyway, I wanted to bring that back as to be a science, really. That's I left architecture partly for that reason, and partly because I was called by the being I call the master to do this work.
Yeah. And you have done an amazing body of work. I mean, I've cited a lot of your material in the long series on Francis Bacon that I did that a lot of my viewers will know about. But I've also gone into your material in Zoants, and I want to talk about both of those over the course of the conversation. I am curious to know more about your capacity as a seer. And I've heard you talk about that in some of your lectures that you've given. And I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about how that it began. Was that something you were sort of born with, or that came on at a certain point? And also, what is the experience like cognitively, to be able to experience a sort of depth dimension or energetic dimension to physical reality?
Yeah. Well, I always, as a child, I always had the ability to see the inner world, really, and I was always aware of and could see the teachers I had and guardians and so on. When I was young, I couldn't yet see what I would call now angels and things like that, but I saw these spiritual beings, and they guided my path. But in those days, I learned to keep quiet about it all, because when you see with the mind, you're using the faculty of imagination. And I remember at school, I think it was prep school, and a friend of mine, another boy, blurted out to the teacher, "Well, I can see certain things. Well, I could see the same things myself at the same time." So he was describing them absolutely accurately.
Wow.
And the teacher yelled at him and said, "Oh, don't be stupid. It's just your imagination." And so that was it. It shut it down. And so it shut down his whole ability to do that. So I learned very fast, keep quiet about these things. And even when I started this whole work off in the late 1970s, leading the foundation of the Francis Bacon Research Trust, even then I was very careful who I shared it with. I only shared it with a few people. But now I can talk much more openly about it. Things have changed dramatically. Right. But I was very careful to start with. But the actually seeing angels and the landscape energies and chakras in the land, as well as in people and so on, that happened when I was at university in Cambridge. And I used to research all the mythologies and religions and so on of the whole world, really, just to get to know them. I was interested in it whilst I was doing architecture. But I love going out into the land, just seeing what the ancients had done, And I went out, I kept going out for these walks in the land, and I went out one day and I suddenly could see all the energies flowing through the land. And I saw what I would call now landscape angels. Angels. Angel means thought of God, divine thought. That's why they're called intelligences. So it's the spiritual intelligence, the overlighting energy of a landscape that is overseeing and helping that land to evolve, just as we have our own guardian angels that does the same work, which I do see. I've seen those for a long time, our guardian angels. But now I was seeing it in the land, and they started to teach me about the land from then on. So that was while I was at university. Then I met a few people I could talk about this, and who became great friends. They were they're much older than me, but they kind of encouraged me and so on. And and it sort of developed from then. And then I got married. I was up in Edinburgh at the time, and do you want to know this whole story?
I
don't
mean,
know if
yeah, I'm
it's
interested in it for sure because it's a rare gift, you know, but it's
Yeah.
something that is or at least rare in our society, but it's something that traces back in time, and we know that these seers and sort of sages have existed throughout human history. And so it's interesting to be able to hear about your experience as somebody who represents this tradition and who is a part
Yeah.
of this.
Well, I was, until I moved up to Edinburgh to be with the wonderful woman who's now my wife. She went to Edinburgh University, so I followed her up there to be with her, and at that time we lived apart, and was one weekend I couldn't meet her, so I went for a walk, and suddenly found the bus I was going to take to the hills, Pentland Hills, had left. It was a bit early, so I missed it. I was about to go back to my lodgings, and then I had this tap on the shoulder and said, I was told to follow your nose. So I'd learned by then, you know, if you do what you're told when you got the teacher teaching like that. And I mean, you can always say no, of course, but I'd learned to follow that. And I crossed the road and started going through housing estates. And then suddenly it's like walking through like a wall of light, you know, wall of energy, like going into through a bubble, you know, the surface of a bubble. And suddenly all the houses disappeared, and I was in pure landscape. There was the river in front of me, the River Leith, and a lovely hill the other side. And I saw certain ceremonies going on the hill and so on. And somehow I got across the river. Still don't know how I did it. But I was across the river, standing on the hill in this, what looked like a stone circle, but all the stones were shining. And then I was shot up high above that, and made to see or to remember. They told me, you know, remember, this is in your soul memory. And I saw a whole landscape temple from the south of France and north of Scotland. And then I was taken up higher and into a temple on high, and then with others we made our vow for incarnation, really, and asked again, did we want to still carry out what we had vowed to do before we incarnated? And I said, well, we all said yes, of course. And we were sent back down. And I was sent back down on Earth to the top of this hill, and found I was in the middle of lots of houses. Of course, no stone circle or anything to be seen. And but then I could smell this incense, which was kind of confirmation for me. And then I wrote, I was a member of the White Eagle Lodge then, so I wrote off and said, look, I've had this experience. Is it true? You know, is there anything, because it could be illusion, you know.
Right.
And I got back, no, it's definitely true. Some of it you're seeing as the past and some of the future and so on. And it gave me a bit of confidence. And then after that, in the years that followed, I set out to really check if each of those chakras in the land was absolutely true and so on. And so I spent many years researching that. But straight after the vision, I mean, soon after, a month or two after that vision, Sarah and I got married. We had our honeymoon on Iona. And then we had a second holiday, as it were, to have it on a retreat at the White Eagle Lodge. And then we met this amazing woman who recognized us. She was an old woman. She recognized us. We were still young, you know, we were in our 20s. and she just somehow knew who we were, recognized us, and started talking about Francis Bacon. Well, that was someone I didn't know much about at all. But it rang bells. And then we went back to Edinburgh, and I didn't know what to make of it and so on. So I just got back into architecture. And then a few weeks after that, I was woken up with a very vivid dream. And in the dream, I saw this being I called straight away, the master, you know, just acknowledge this greater soul, master. And he made a certain gesture, which I knew had a meaning, but I didn't know at that time what it was. And then he gave me a message to write down, to send to Hope. And I hadn't a clue what the message was about, but he woke me up like that in order that I'd remember the message, write it down, and send it off straight away to this lady I'd met at the retreat called Hope. So I did that. And I got a letter by return of post saying, I've waited 20 years for this, she said. Now we can begin our work together.
Wow.
So it began. I was sort of thrown straight into the Bacon story, which I didn't really know anything about at that time, but she helped take me deeper into it. Then I had to do all my own research, of course, and met some extraordinary people, and all the time being guided by this being I call the master. And then eventually it just, well, I think I was meditating when it happened. So I was practicing meditation then. And I suddenly felt, I was asking questions in my mind, suddenly I felt this, like a door open in the top of my head. And I was in a totally different consciousness, and all the answers were there.
Mm.
And I call that the Rosicrucian level of consciousness, or at least the beginning of it. And so that's the state I've been in ever since. But of course, developing it more and more as life goes on, and learning. You know, when we left Edinburgh to go south, the master said, right, now I want you to meditate on the hoof. Not just sit and meditate, but do whatever you're doing, hold that consciousness. So I had to train myself to do that. So, I mean, after all these years now, 40, 50 years, I have, you know, I'm in two consciousnesses all at the same time, simultaneously. And so, you know, I can see these things. Even on Zoom, I can see things, which I've always found amazing.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, it's not as well as if you were physically in front of me, but I can see some things, yeah.
So let me ask you about this, about your experience of having a guiding light in your life, someone you call the master. Do you associate that with your higher self, or do you see it as something that is like a being or a light, a divine presence that is somewhat separate from your higher self and guiding that higher self? Or do you see it as the core of your own being, this interaction?
Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, we all do have a higher self, the immortal part of us. And but the being I call the master, the older soul, as it were, that's a separate soul, individual soul, with many, many incarnations, who I work with, you know, and he guides me, teaches me. But at an even higher level, of course, we're all one. We become one. But at a lower level, we start to split, become more individual, and then we have our personal incarnations, and that's even more individual, as it were.
Right.
Different incarnations, yeah. So it's gradually working out what's what, really, and how it works. But there are mathematical laws behind all this. So once you get to know the mathematical laws, it's really helpful.
You mean mathematical laws in terms of like the sacred geometry of creation, in terms of how the spiritual world interacts with the physical world, in terms of the creation process?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the ways to understand the laws of life, laws of the universe, is through mathematics, really, which is what scientists do as well.
Right.
And mathematics is combination of number and geometry. Because the two go together, you can't separate them. And so that was one of the things as I developed this gift a bit more when I was called to work with it. I began to see the geometry in nature. You know, every chakra has geometry behind it, and the chakra system has geometry behind it, and the auras people have geometry, and the same thing with all living forms. You know, all of nature has this manifest geometry hidden behind it. And of course, as an architect was a brilliant training, really, because, you know, as an architect, if you're building a particular sacred building, you use geometry behind it. But when it's constructed, people will go into the building like a cathedral or something, and they won't have a clue normally that it's all based on geometry. They'll just have a sense, if you've done it well, they have a sense of, oh, it feels good, you know, it does its purpose. But actually it does its purpose because it's based on perfect geometry and proportion and so on that's suitable for the purpose, with chakras and everything.
Right. Going back to the sort of out of body, I don't know if you want to think of it as an initiation that you went through with the event you were talking about in the stone circle and being sort of lifted up, and also with your experiences with having a sort of guiding master. It's on, as I understand it, this is what Manly Hall teaches. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about the Rosicrucian order, that the Rosicrucian order is actually, it's not just a terrestrial secret society, but more significantly, the basis of it is this sort of metaphysical temple almost, or something that you access out of body. And so therefore it is something that is sort of kept to people who are able to do this. So the Rosicrucian initiates are those who are almost like what we imagine sort of sages from the East being like, you know, from India or China. Like we kind of have a tradition that we accept more from the East, that there are people who can do these sort of psychic accomplishments. But in the West, we don't really talk about it that much, but that's where I think this lineage of secret societies comes in, and this lineage of the wisdom tradition and esoteric philosophy is that is keeping alive in the West this idea that these same like society of sages essentially do exist. So is that your feeling now, having gone deep into the Rosicrucian mystery with Francis Bacon and having your own experiences? Was the true Rosicrucian order one that was happening on this plane that you're talking about?
Yes, it's a level of consciousness. It's, you know, it's a higher level than a normal consciousness most people function in. It's a transcendent consciousness. So, but one doesn't have to sit in meditation to reach it. You can actually do everyday work while you've got it. That's what we're meant to do. And every labor of love, as Francis Bacon calls it, you know, like love's labor's lost. You know, that's labor of love being lost.
Right.
Well, it's when you can do it, it's also known as charity in the Christian church. When you're doing it all the time, you're helping your consciousness keep on reaching that level, and so that level of consciousness increases and increases, and suddenly you find you're in touch with even more, and so on. But it doesn't stop you doing the hard work. You have to work it on the ground as well, you know. and it's all about, you know, when you're in that consciousness, all you want to do is help the world, help people, help others, and so on. You know, to channel this love and the wisdom through in the best way you can. And you follow the guidance, because everybody has a role to play. So the Shakespeare plays, you know, we're all actors on the stage of the world. So we have to learn our parts and do it as best we can.
Right.
Yeah.
So when I think about Francis Bacon and all the incredible things that he accomplished and was associated with, it's almost like when you just start stacking these on top of each other, you can't even believe that a individual was so accomplished and could be involved in such foresighted activities, and have left such an incredible legacy of contributions. So in your view, knowing what you know, would you say that Francis Bacon was an incarnation of one of these type of entities that you're talking about as a master, as someone who was sort of like
absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's why he had to keep it so secret, except from a few others who could recognize it. But it was like my early days, at school, I learned to keep quiet, and otherwise it gets stamped on or suppressed in some sort of way. And so he had to be very discreet, very quiet about what he was able to do and what he actually did. But some others did know it. They recognized it, and of course joined him with the work that had to be done, which he called the Great Instauration. That's he basically took the name from from one of the Bibles, where it talks about rebuilding this Temple of Solomon. The Temple of Solomon's been desecrated and fallen into ruins, or it's been pulled down, but the foundations still exist.
Right.
So Prince Zerubbabel comes, he's able to lead some Jews back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. But he builds a new temple on top of the old foundations. But he has to also go down to the foundations to what's called the secret crypt and find the bit of wisdom that he still needs to add to the wisdom he knows to get the whole picture, right, so that he can build the temple properly. So that's acted out still in Freemasonry, in the Royal Arch degree, or Holy Royal Arch degree of Freemasonry. That's acted out. Well, what it also is about is you become a Freemason first, and you learn to three fundamental craft degrees are learning to make your desires or will into loving ones, goodwill, which is God's will. That's the wisdom. That's fundamental wisdom. And that's an energy, and that produces a thought, and you have to turn that thought into good thought, hopeful thought, and then you put it into action in a charitable way, in a loving way, to help others and so on like that. And if you're successful and do that well, there's something in you that suddenly sees, oh yeah, that was good. That wasn't so good. That wasn't so good. But that was definitely good. So next time I can get it better still. You have a kind of revelation. And if it's a really good revelation, it lights you up. Because as you do a work of action, it raises the central kundalini. And that has the ability to raise the heart, goes into the heart chakra, and raise your heart love up to your head, and you become illumined, even if only a fraction of a second. Illumination. And but that's the Rosicrucian consciousness. It's that consciousness of what we would call a sainted person. Mm-hmm. But you've got to keep on doing that labor of love to keep that burning, as it were, and that's that light going. And then you start creating what's called the light body, the celestial
and you're describing that is very much tied into service. Like, it's the act of doing the service that is part of the process of raising this energy.
Yeah, it's the only way to do it. That's simple. But there's lots of ways of doing that, and you can belong to an organization or institution, or you can do it on your own, and lots of people actually do a wonderful service of love just amongst their families and children and so on, like that, without really realizing what they're doing. But they usually get that moment of what you could call joy or bliss. And the original Hebrew word for light that was created on the first day, the Hebrew word is translated as light, but actually it really means delight, joy, happiness. just like the Dalai Lama keeps saying, you know, be happy. Well, that's it. You know, that is the light. Be happy, and it makes you shine.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you, when you were describing the master and your experience of that, I was reminded somewhat of a book that Manly Hall wrote called The Guru. Are you aware of this book, or have you read it?
Yes.
Is that something that, when he was talking about, because in this book he's kind of giving an account of something that he experienced while he was in India, although I think that there's a lot of personal aspects to it for himself that he didn't so clearly state. But in the book he talks about how this sort of guru type figure in India, like the processes involved with his sort of overseeing a number of disciples, and how he himself was the disciple of a yet higher sort of spiritual entity, that I can't remember what he called him, like the Lord of Lords or something like that. But yeah, anyway, that kind of brings me to Manly Hall, because this is something that you mentioned in one of our emails, is that you had met Manly Hall. But I'm wondering, I want to get your impression of the man, and also some of his, the work that you've encountered by him. But I mean, I gotta say, my opinion of Manly Hall is that he is also sort of one of these secret, I mean, I can't say what level he is, but he's definitely some type of a sage, or somebody in the mold of a Francis Bacon type figure. Because I mean, I can just tell it from having spent, 6 or 7 years like nonstop trying to not only study his material, but put it together and show the sort of architecture of teachings that he's laid out. And so, it's a staggering, accomplishment that he did through his life. So I'm wondering, how did you come about meeting him, and what were your impressions of him and his work?
Well, I met him quite late on in his life. You know, he was it was just a few years before his death. Well, I met him twice, and but it was a calling, and he knew we were going to come, and we knew we had to go there, and so it was very friendly, lovely meeting, like old souls meeting, and at least that's where I felt it, and yeah, we straight away got on like old friends. It was lovely. He's a very, very fine soul, and called to his particular work of service, which is what he did so wonderfully well, And he had his own path of training to get there, to remind him of what he had to do and so on like that.
Right.
And he carried it out right to the very end. I think the end bit was difficult for him for various reasons, but then that often happens, the soul. Yeah. Anyway, that's a different story. We won't go into that.
Right.
Yeah.
So, one of the things I would like to do in our conversation is maybe take a kind of a survey tour of history, but in the process talk about a lot of key issues that we've been introducing so far. And in this capacity, I want to draw upon your work in both your Francis Bacon Research Trust role, but also Zoans, because Zoans gets into a little bit of the more general, broad themes of the wisdom teachings and the mystery schools. So I'd actually like to start, and all the topics that we're going to talk about are things that I've written about and talked about on my podcast, on my website. But I want to get your take on these things now, because a lot of the work I do is sort of putting together Manly Hall's teachings about these ideas, and bringing in a few other influences as well, but primarily Manly Hall. But now I have you here, so I would like to get your take on certain things. So let's start off with the mystery schools. So when we're talking about the mystery schools, this is something that is in the heyday, is in the pre-Christian era. So we're talking about like classical pagan civilization. And so what is your sort of definition and concept of the mystery schools? And maybe we can start there.
Okay. Well, the name mysteries is from the Greek mysteria, and and we get our modern word mystic from it, but it actually refers to sacred drama.
Mm.
You know, going out into the landscape and working with the landscape as well as other people and plants and trees and creatures, nature, but guided from above. So you're learning the Hermetic wisdom of linking heaven above with the earth beneath. You know, and of course, heaven above can be to a certain extent the sky and what's going on in the sky, but really it refers to the mind. So whatever we do will affect our thinking, so that we can put something into action from an idea, but then we get feedback as a result of that action, which can change the idea, make it a bit better than before, and then we put into action again. So you've always got this constant as above, so below, so below, so above for the doing of the great work. But then there are higher levels still, which are overseeing and directing it all in another way. And we in our consciousness, we feel it's higher and higher, but actually we're going deeper and deeper into the heart. That's really what's happening.
Right.
So it's all heart centered, and but the mystery schools are those that practice this sacred drama. So, and the mystic was seen as the second degree. First of all, you have to become a kathar, which means purified, the pure one, and that's controlling your will, your desires, your emotions.
And that's the lower mysteries, right?
Yeah, making them good. You know, just like Freemasonry, really. So the second degree was developing the thought level, but seeing it acted by others who were initiates, proper initiates, either on stage or in the land. And then eventually you would be invited to take part yourself in it. And then you'd become the seer. The Greek word for that is epopt. You'd suddenly see the wisdom there, see the mystery, and really get it. And then beyond that, you go further into what's nowadays called the Rosicrucian level, and you become the proper adept, and then the master, and so on like that in your development. But the mystery school really is a school that will practice all of that. And there are formal ones in the past, but also informal ones. You know, life is a mystery school, really. You know, we're all actors on the stage, but we have to wake up to you know, play our part properly as a work of service. And but there were formal mystery schools set up to try and help people and train them, because we all need help. Everybody needs help.
Right. Yeah.
Nobody can do it in isolation, because we're not alone, never alone. And so the mystery schools go back a long way in time. You know, to start with, I studied the ancient Egyptian ones, and then the Sumerian ones, and then eventually led to the Dionysian ones that are mostly mainland Europe. The Dionysus story is actually in the landscape of Europe. And then of course the Middle East ones, and then you got India and so on. Every part of the land of the world has its own mythology and mystery schools, and the teaching that's in their symbolism and words, you know, the words of their language and the symbolism that they use in their mysteries, which relate to the landscape. And so and there are different levels of mystery school. You know, there's the smaller ones, and then the bigger ones, and the bigger ones. Where the bit bigger ones, you take in a whole country or continent, and you travel from place to place. But to start with, you just be in one location, and so on like that. So yeah.
And so it's important, I think it's interesting and important to know that there were mystery schools in all these different civilizations. And although they were customized to the people, they taught a common body of teachings, essentially, is a spirit
Yes,
of
that's
sort of
right.
like spiritual cosmology and also esoteric practices. So this sort of suggests that these were all linked together at a deep level.
Yes, absolutely. And is an overall myth, at least in the Western world, we have an overall myth that's based on Atlas and Atlantis. I mean, later on, that whole scenario of Atlantis can manifest at different times in the world, but it's just an overall myth. So Atlantis is the cosmos, basically,
Mm-hmm.
full Atlantis, and Atlas means pillar of the universe. The axis mundi, the pillar of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
Same, it means the same as Shiva. Shiva in India means exactly the same, And so you got Shiva, the pillar, and then you've got Shakti dancing around it, which is the soul, the human souls, and all the circles of the capital of Atlantis. Circles represent the different auras that are created,
Mm.
and each with a different purpose and so on. But it also refers not just to space, but also time. So time cycles also have the same wisdom in it, and so the one that Plato talks about happened about 9,000 BC, and that was a real destruction of a civilization which had once been a grand civilization practicing things well, and then it got very, very corrupt, and it started invading. It was actually associated with the Americas, Central America and the USA area, and just what's now Canada and the Great Lakes was covered by a huge ice field. And the ice was just beginning to melt then. So it had a huge lake of an ice lake that began to melt, but it was all held back by this wall of ice. And then there was a comet crash into the earth, fragments broke up, but the main fragment crashed into that ice field and instantly melted the ice, which flooded right over what's now the USA and Central America, and wiping out population basically in an instant,
Right.
virtually. And then tsunamis created right across the sea. And I have memories of this, and there were mystery schools set up and knew that something was going to happen like this, and they had to stand in certain places linking with each other to try to stop everywhere being totally overwhelmed. And so they did their job. But the sea levels eventually, around the world went up quite high as a result. And so wiped out a lot of coastal communities. And then it subsided a bit and so on. But that's what Plato talks about. And then when Francis Bacon and John Dee and so on referring to Atlantis, they're referring to that Plato's story, and referring to America in that story. So there are two ways to understand the myth. The myth is really about the whole cosmos, and it's something that will recur. You've got the golden age, and then it goes to the silver age, and then gradually to a dark age. And that's to do with a time cycle. And we're in the darkest moment now of a great age, for instance, 26,000 years. We are at the midwinter point. Just Christmas just beginning, the 26,000 year cycle. So we're in a very, very dark age, and it will cause destruction. There will be destruction because mankind's karma is so bad.
Right.
It brings that about. But at the same time, there's the birth of the new coming out, which one can also see everywhere. And that gets stronger and stronger and stronger until eventually the old that's destroyed just becomes the compost, and all the new plants emerge and in glory, really. Yeah.
So Atlantis was really the origin of not only the mystery schools, but I would say all the institutions of human life, human civilization, right?
Yeah.
So in your, you know, in the sort of work I do and kind of based on Manly Hall, I kind of place Atlantis as a previous age in a sort of a 7-cycle arc. So that was a previous age, and it also represented a previous form of human being, meaning the human being is an archetype, and the previous archetypal form, physically and psychologically, is what played out over Atlantean times. And then the deluge is sort of like the hard transition into a new era. And in the esoteric teachings, this era would be called the Aria. I don't know if that's something that you've come across. That's something that Manly Hall talks a lot about. This idea of the Aria is our modern sort of age that took over from the previous cycle of Atlantis. And so it seems that the karma of Atlantis, even though we moved ages, the karma of Atlantis has also been brought over. And I notice a lot of archetypal themes playing out in our current moment in time that seem to trace very heavily back to some of the themes that are associated traditionally with Atlantis, such as a fall into sort of materialism and sort of black magic. Even you could look at some of the modern scientific misuses of technology and to create, you know, destruction and empire, as being a sort of modern version of what is said to have happened in Atlantis with their sort of sorcerer magicians and such. Is that kind of how you look at it, or do you depart?
Absolutely. I mean, Atlantis, it's the cosmos, but it's made up of time cycles. So, you know, it's like microcosms of the macrocosm. So there are microcosms within microcosms, you know. So that's exactly it, talking about time cycles. And the Great Age is just one cycle of that, and made up of 12 ages. But that's the easiest one for us to see, because we're right at the point of the end of a great age and beginning of a new one. But to my mind, that's also part of an even greater time cycle. And so when we're creating a new now, we will create something very, very new. Huge step up in human evolution can take place. That's the possibility.
Right.
Every cycle has its golden age, usually associated with what people call summertime, but also the beginning time. The beginning time, like the mystery schools of old, would always take the solstice suns as the markers of time, because the equinox suns are not good enough because of the Earth tilting throws the whole map out. But if you take the solstice suns, midsummer and midwinter, then you've got a more accurate thing. So if you take the midsummer sun, it's now on the cusp of Gemini to Taurus and moving into Taurus. Now, Taurus is known as the alpha sign of the zodiac. So when the midsummer sun goes into Taurus, then Taurus rules the throat, then the word is sounded and creates the new. And that's known as the alpha sign, and it gives out the wisdom. So that's known as a golden age. It's a golden age, starts the process, but then it has to be picked up by the whole of humanity, the whole world, and that will be done in the summertime. You know, in 6 ages further, well, 3-4 ages further on, and then you've got your summer period. Yeah.
Let me before moving on, kind of moving our timeline up, I want to ask another question about the mystery schools. The way I kind of think about this is because it's existing in multiple civilization groups at the same time. We could say there's an archetypal quality to it, meaning there's a pattern that is ingrained in human life, and I would say in nature as a whole. The idea that there would be such an institution as this, like it didn't arise historically. It kind of arose at a deep level within nature, and it's inseparable from human existence. The fact that there would be an institution dedicated to the linkage of earth and heaven, I guess I would say. Is that how you kind of look at it in terms of the mystery schools as being something that is an interface? It's an institution that is responsible for interfacing with a sort of higher level of spiritual consciousness and sort of spiritual entities or enlightened humans and the sort of lower castes of society.
Yeah, it's absolutely what it is. And I mean, as you get towards or into golden age or getting towards it, you could say there's mystery schools everywhere. And so most of the population of the world get that and they're being guided. But in the dark age, the mystery schools seem to be very few in number as a result, because the general consciousness is quite materialistic.
Right.
Doesn't mean to say it's necessarily bad. You know, as long as people try to do good deeds and to love and to have friendships and so on. But it's a materialistic age. It just means they have to work that much harder to get through all the difficulties. Well, they're creating something very wonderful by doing that. It's only those who are seduced off the path, you know, that sort of path, and they do really bad deeds and so on. Then they've got a bad karma to deal with after that. But so the greater the test doesn't mean to say you're in a worse situation. Right. Soul-wise, it means this is the way where you could be tested so to do the best things of all. Just like athletes, you know.
Right.
Best athletes have to go through very serious training and tests and break bones and things like that, probably. Right. Yeah.
So in some of the experiences that you've had that you talked about earlier in our conversation, do you associate that with a type of experience of being initiated or participating in these sort of deeper institutions of the mysteries?
Yeah, I mean, initiation really is not just doing good things, but it's actually getting that consciousness, linking with that consciousness of heaven, if you like, heaven and earth. And once you've got that consciousness, you've entered into the mystery, and that's what initiation means. From Latin initio, to enter into. So you consciously enter into doing good things and thinking about it and trying to do better and so on like that. So that's what sets the initiate apart from just the ordinary person who's a loving person and so on. But the initiate is conscious of it and makes that link and determination. Yeah.
One of the ways I think about initiation is that it has to do, because it's a loaded term that a lot of people will interpret in a lot of different ways, but you know, I find the most helpful way to think about it is that it is associated with evolution. So you know, comparing humans to, let's say, the other forms of life on the planet, like animals and plants and you know, in esoteric philosophy there's a mineral phase of life as well, that these are things that are, their evolution is sort of somewhat unconscious, that, you know, Mother Nature is evolving them, but it's more of a passive process. But with the thing that's special about the human kingdom is that we have to participate in our own evolution. And so the process of achieving those stages in evolution is the process that we call initiation, because as you rise in the different levels of initiation, what you're actually doing is you're proceeding along the pathway of your own evolution as a soul, I guess I would say. Does that make sense to you, that kind of framing?
Yeah. Yes, very much. Yeah.
So we had the era of the mystery schools where they were public, and I mean, they were open to the public, but they were sort of out in the open in a way because they worked within the temples by and large, and the priesthood was kind of where they were located in ancient civilization. And there were these grand mass rituals, mass sort of lower mystery initiation type things, sort of collective events that would take place that were associated with these mystery school processes. But that sort of gradually declines all across the world and is replaced in a new era. In the West, that new era becomes the Christian age. And in the Middle East, it becomes Islam, and then in the East it becomes its own version of a more orthodox approach to religion. The institutions kind of restructure themselves, but like we said before, the mystery schools are an archetypal institution, so they wouldn't disappear, but they would change form with this transition in ages. So what can you tell us about this period of time, this critical period of time, where the old mystery school system sort of gradually fades out from view, at least in the form it wasn't in pagan civilization, and then what happens to it in this new era, where it seems to have, at least in the West, it seems to have disappeared, but it doesn't actually disappear. So what happened to it?
Well, it's certainly from the Middle East, Europe, and Americas. It was how Christianity spread. But I mean, even the pre-Christianity, there were always two levels of teaching, introducing people to the mysteries, to the wisdom, basically. And that's for them to take part on an outer level with temple celebrations and processions and things like that. And Christianity simply carried that on. You go to church services and you have your procession of, some saint or the Virgin Mary or whatever it is, or the cross, and so on. And that's the general public to take part in. So you say, I've been to this, and I've had some sort of experience. But then there's the other level is to go deep into it, and you make a vow, basically, and that's when you enter into the mystery as a true initiate, and so that was always there in the past, in the previous pre-Christian cultures. There are always the mystery schools behind just for the few, because only a few would choose to do this, and always behind the outer trappings. And the same thing with Christianity. So Christianity itself carried on. I mean, Jesus's main teachings, what he taught, was straight out of the Dionysian mysteries. He taught by experience. Took his disciples, apostles, to experience these initiations in that way, because the Dionysian mysteries were what the Greeks were doing, and it was mostly Greek culture at that time. And he used that to try to teach the Hebrews what they actually had in their teachings, but they'd lost sight of it. And I mean, he belonged to a certain Essene faction, which were, that was a mystery school, and it was trying to bring back the fundamental laws of God is love, you love God, which is, most Jews always did that. That's their first great teaching, but they lost sight of the second teaching. You love God, but you have to love individuals as well. Love the universal being, but love each other and love nature. They'd lost sight of that. It was hidden, and in the Bible it's hidden away too. So Jesus pointed this out. This is it. Well, the Dionysian mysteries that became known later as the Orphic mysteries were all about God is love. That's the starting point. And so that's what he acted out in the landscape of Israel as it was at that time, made up of Judea and in Galilee in the north, and then you had Canaan in between. At that time it was split up. But he still worked that great landscape temple as he went through these different initiations with his disciples. And then he sent them all over to the apostles. He sent over to Europe, because that was the future place. Europe manifests the throat chakra of the planet. It's the Taurus, ruled by Taurus. So when it came to the end of the age, he said, prepare people in Europe for the end of the age, which is now, because that's when Europe has to learn to sound the notes, sound the right voice, sound the wisdom, to recreate things anew in terms of the planetary chakras. And of course, every chakra has its own system, 7 chakras in. So you'll find the Taurus thing in every part of the world as well. But for the planet, on the planet scale, it's Europe, and that's why the disciples were sent there to work with that. And they were a mystery school basically, and they set up their own little mystery schools. But outwardly, they had to do something for the general public to draw them in and give them the experience, and so on. And it, developed from there. But all the time.
Well, one of the differences is that in the older pattern, in the previous pattern, there wasn't a conflict between the formal institutions of religion and these mystery schools. But what happens in this new age, and this sort of after the transition period and into what we just might call the Christian era, is that the outer body of the church becomes diametrically opposed to the mysteries, almost sees them as an existential threat, and it is responsible for quashing these mystery schools that, as you're saying, Jesus, the adept, worked to set up initially. So there's a bit of an irony there, with the outer body of Christianity kind of persecuting the inner body, and that's something that didn't seem to have happened in the earlier age. So was that one of the main themes that happened after this transition?
And it's the humanity for millennia have suffered from dictatorship. People just want to rule everything. It's really greed,
Right.
They want power over everything. They want to steal other people's land and whatnot like that. That's dictatorship. And so humanity has suffered that for a long period of time. But as we get towards the more materialistic age, which we're in now, Christianity, that dictatorship came up more and more powerfully. So eventually the young church was taken over, I think about 3rd century or something it was, or 4th century AD. The Roman emperor, because originally there were 5 bishops originally. 5 popes. Pope meant papa, is a title of respect to a bishop.
And
but there were 5 bishops of big metropolises originally. One was Rome, another was Constantinople, as it became, another was Ephesus, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. But gradually, hordes of Islam and so on started taking over these places. So it ended up really with just Rome and Constantinople. So there was a pope in each of those. Well, the Roman emperor of that time, he wanted to govern everything, real dictator, he wanted everything, and to restore the Roman Empire to what it was, to its glory, a bit like Putin wants to do now. And so he said to the Bishop of Rome, declare yourself to be the supreme pope and the only pope. And the Bishop of Rome said, no, I'm not going to do that. So he poisoned him and then put in his own puppet. And there starts the nasty side of Roman Catholicism.
Yeah, the Roman Catholic Church really becomes sort of a weird extension of the former Roman Empire, and sort of replicated the psychology of that imperial mindset.
That's it. And that's why Rosicrucians, which was the English mystery school, they decided to use the name Rosy Cross, which is an ancient symbol, but they would use that as part of their name because they had a particular work to do. And that's why in the Rosicrucian manifestos, they appear to be so anti the Pope, papacy,
right?
Because that's the dictatorship, political dictatorship, pretending to be religious.
Right.
And so that's why they appear so anti it. But they weren't anti the good people in the church or anything like that. But the whole thing needed a reformation, needs to be reformed,
right?
And made better. Yeah.
One interesting point that comes up in this period of time that we're talking about and that is the transition from the age of Aries into the age of Pisces. So I know that you have talked about the great year a lot in your work, and I'm wondering, what is the significance of the age of Pisces? What are some of the archetypal themes that we can see them playing out in this drama that we're talking about?
Yeah, we call about age of Aries, age of Pisces from the point of view of the spring equinox
Right.
sun spring equinox. So it's a bit out of sync with real timing, but it still works, you know, to see things in that way, because we're all affected by the solstice and equinox suns wherever they are. That's the, you know, 4 of the main power points of time. And so the Piscean age, you always have the other sign, the other side, complementary sign to take into account. So Pisces was complemented by Virgo, the Virgin.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've got Christianity, the not so good side of Christianity, suddenly deciding it's anti the feminine.
Mm-hmm.
So at some point, the Roman Catholic Church decided women didn't have any souls. I mean, can you imagine that? I mean, it's just pathetic. And anyway, they decided that, they decreed that. So only men were to be priests and so on like that, because only they were capable of it. And so it carried on. It's only just beginning to disappear now, you know, in our lifetime, or my lifetime anyway. And, you know, it's only in my lifetime that women got the vote, or just in my parents' lifetime, I mean. And now it's being made a bit more equal, but it's had to be done outside the Roman Catholic Church, who's still got that. But I was fascinated. There was, I think it was Pope Paul something. Anyway, the famous speaker, he used to travel to different countries, get millions of people coming to listen to him, what he had to say. And he was in Ireland once, and this was reported in the media. Several newspapers picked it up. But somebody in the crowd asked a question of him, said, what is the spiritual reason for priests to be unmarried and celibate? Do you know what he said?
What did he say?
He said, well, there is no spiritual reason. It's because some time ago, the church decided it could not afford to support the families and the wives and children of their priests. So it then asked priests to be, you know, to be unmarried for that reason. I mean, can you believe it? Purely mercenary decision. You know, just this shows how materialistic this all became. And then you go to Rome and you see all this splendor. Well, even in Spain, you see all this riches of the church and so on, and everybody else living in poverty. You know, it's just extraordinary. And that's completely reversal of what Jesus and his disciples were teaching.
Yeah, that is Rome. That's the oligarchy of Rome sort of putting on bishop's robes and just perpetuating in a new form. I'm interested in a little bit in exploring this idea of a difference in how you mark the great year time period, moving from the spring equinox to the spring equinox, right? Not the solstice, and then the winters and summer solstices. You're saying that that's the preferred marker. So what is that when you read things in terms of the summer and winter equinoxes? What do we look at? What are we looking at here? What age does that tell us that we're in, and what are some of the themes that way of looking at it reveals?
Well, if you work with a proper map of the heavens, where you've got the center of the zodiac is what's called the occult pole, or the hidden pole, because there's no star marking it. But all the maps of the heavens we're given, people are given, are always centered on wherever the North Pole star is. Polaris it's called, which is at the moment coincides with the star Arcas in the tail of Ursa Minor. But in, you know, not so long, it'll be moved away from that. And so you have everybody begin different map of the heavens. But to get it accurate, you've got to take the center of the zodiac, which is the occult pole. And then you find the solstices are always spot on. They always give you the right marker of time. Whereas the equinox, spring equinox, for instance, we're not at the moment going into the age of Aquarius. We're still in the age of Pisces. Still some way to go, some, a few centuries to go before we reach that cusp of Pisces into the next one, into Aquarius. Whereas the Indian astrologers, they will take the autumn equinox as the marker. So from their point of view, we've been in the age of Leo for some, for several centuries. left Pisces, left Virgo a long time ago. So that's why modern astrologers in the West, for instance, and in the East, they would do the same. They have to make, they know it's off, so they have to make adjustments in order to make it work. But that's why modern astronomers think modern astrology is just nonsense, because the things don't match. Where they think, say, planets are, it's not so. Where the sun is, it's not so in the sky when it's being said. And
so this has to do with the difference between a sidereal zodiac and the sort of terrestrial zodiac, right? I know I've seen this in different places, but I think I've seen you also talk about this, how particularly in the West, we normally read a horoscope and position all the different elements, the zodiac and the planets, that there is a adjustment factor that we need to incorporate, because we're normally reading it according to the terrestrial zodiac reading, whereas it seems like the more true reading would be based on the sidereal approach, which I think has to do with some of these elements you're talking about. Do you know what I'm talking? Do you have any comments on that?
The biggest change, really, which Vedic astrology doesn't do, it's always changing to be accurate. But Western astrologers will take a star map as it was, nearly 2,000 years ago, and it's not accurate anymore, because time has moved on. Everything, the sun has moved on, and so the sun doesn't appear in the same place at a certain time of the year that it did before, sort of thing. It's you've got the thing called the precession going on.
Right.
So it's 2,000 years out of date. So what Western astrologers are really doing is identifying the month of the time that it was marking 2,000 years ago. So so really they could use months instead of astrological signs.
Right.
Then people might understand it better.
It seems like in terms of these cycles, the master cycle is the cycle around the north precessional pole. You were talking about the pole star and how that moves over the course of time, because that moves according to a 25,000 year period, which is the great Platonic year, right?
Yeah, that's right.
One of the interesting things that this is actually something I'm going to be going into in a future article in more depth, is going into a small work of Manly P. Hall's. It's called The Piscean Age, A System of World Prophecy. I don't know if you've seen this work. I think it's out of print. I was very lucky to stumble upon a copy years ago. And in this work, he gives a date for, now this is going back and referencing this idea between Aries and Pisces, these ages, but he marks the transition point in ages between Aries and Pisces as being 325 AD. And he says that this is the point when the Council of Nicaea was officially formed, and this sort of set the stage for the sort of Christian age that we'll say it came about. And it also was a key period in the sort of decline of the old sort of pagan order. So he marks 325 as being the origin date. And if you then draw out a map of 2,160 years after this, that puts the transition of the age of Aquarius in around 2400 AD. And then the midway point, interesting, between these two dates falls right on the Renaissance. It's 1450. And in this work, he also shows how this zodiac arrangement, or this analysis, can be divided up into sections of 5 and sections of 6, and how each marks key points in our, you can see how certain key events in our historical cycle in the past 2,000 years have fallen on dates that would be suggested by this way of reading the transition in ages. But I've seen in your work, you have pointed to around 0 AD as a transition point in the beginning of the age of Pisces. Do you have any comment on this whole topic that you can share with us?
Yes, I mean, again, it's what time of the year you choose your sun to be at, whether it's an equinox sun or a solstice. And Mandy Hall, clearly took the equinox sun.
Right.
So it gives you that 300 years odd discrepancy to what a solstice sun would mark it for. In India, it would have been the other way,
Right.
They would have had sort of 300 BC sort of for the starting point. But yes, I've taken the solstice sun. I mean, the real age of Pisces would have been 2,160 years ago, mathematically perfect time, because at the moment you've got the solstice sun going over the cusp of Gemini Taurus, which is where the meridian of the Milky Way crosses the ecliptic. And so those are the only two fixed points where the meridian of the Milky Way crosses the ecliptic on opposite sides of the ecliptic.
And this is based on an observation of modern astronomy, right? Of looking at where things are located in the heavens right now, right?
Yeah, and ancient astrologers were astronomers. They
right.
did the two things, so they knew what was going on, and so they always worked like that. Vedic astronomers, astrologers do the same. So it's always up to date. So they make adjustments accordingly. But that's not to say that their PowerPoints in time, these solstices and equinoxes. So Manly Hall's quite correct to identify certain things happened at that spring equinox, powerful things, because it would have happened. But what he didn't do was look at the things that would have happened if you use the solstice suns as markers.
Right. And it's this reading about that we're at this midpoint where these two planes align, that is referencing this idea you mentioned earlier, that we are at the sort of nadir point of a larger cycle, that we're sort of in the Kali Yuga, so to speak, in the depths of it. So that heralds the idea of great archetypal themes playing out in the world, but also a sort of a moment of a great, perhaps, death and rebirth. Is that some of the themes that would come out of this significant position that we're in terms of this being a key point where a lot of significant alignments are going on?
Yeah, we're in a very powerful, important moment in time the world's going through. I mean, it takes 32 or 36 years for the sun to cross a fixed point on the ecliptic, but the midwinter sun and midsummer sun are slightly out of sync. So if you've got to take both into account. So it could be a period of 40 to 60 years that we've experiencing it. But a lot of people I've heard of or know, including astronomers, think both suns have now passed those fixed points in 2020. So we're now completely in the start of a new great age now. And that's very interesting.
And when did that
COVID
start? Or
suddenly hit everybody then.
what was the date that they thought it was that we passed that threshold? Is there an idea?
A lot of people I know or have heard of think it was 2020 when both suns were completely past that point. When they were centered on those points is another matter. You know, there were certain key moments. I think 2003 was one of them, absolutely centered on it. And you know, it's a difficult thing to work out. To my mind, we were called strongly to do our work we're doing in 1980 because things were beginning to happen then. But it was not until 1992 really it totally took off. And that coincides with what many astronomers thought was happening with the solstice suns. They were starting to go over that point.
Right.
Then.
One interesting thing about 2020 is that there was this significant, I don't know if it was a triple or even a conjunction of 4 planets, but definitely we saw Pluto and Saturn famously meeting, and then there's also at the same time a meeting between Saturn and Jupiter, and that's a very famous conjunction. And so when you go back through history, you see a lot of significant things happening along the cycle of these conjunction points and the various other alignments that happen between Pluto, Saturn, and Saturn, Jupiter. And then Mars came into effect as well during this key period. So you can see what happened in the world as being, in my view, very much tied into themes that are associated with those planetary alignments. But one of them seems to be referencing this idea that we talked about earlier of initiation, of a type of Pluto and Saturn in particular being associated with these trials and tests, but of an initiatic nature. Is that some of what you see as being what has happened in the world the past few years during and after this critical period of alignment?
Yeah, I think we're always affected by the planets of the solar system, just as we're affected by the sun and the moon and so on, because it makes different geometries. And when you've got a massing of planets, it emphasizes that particular geometry. So as an architect, I know if you design spaces in a certain way, you've got to get it right for the purpose. If you change the shape and so on of the space, it changes what people feel and what they will think and what they will do because of the shape of the space.
Right.
And so same in the sky, the whole solar system, you know, the planet will be affected by where the other planets are in relation to the sun and the moon and so on. And conjunctions are powerful, very powerful things to happen. And of course, for a long time, and still now, you know, the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction is taken as the Great Conjunction, it's called.
Right.
And it affects us immensely, particularly when Mars joins it. And that, you know, it's virtually every 20 years, you've got the Great Conjunction. But you've also got the oppositions happening, which is every, you know, 20 years you get the conjunctions, but then 10 years later you get an opposition.
Right.
And it sketches out the Seal of Solomon in the sky. You've got
right.
Seal of Solomon. So that was seen as to do with the Christ, you know, as it was taken. And so it's a powerful thing.
One interesting thing I would like to get your comment on is this idea that, you know, there's this idea of chakras. So in the human form, there's or human mind body system, there's famously a number of chakras. That's what most people associate. the idea with. But in your work with landscape temples, you've also shown how the Earth has a chakra system, and I've seen some diagrams you put together of Britain, and you've shown how the chakra system aligns on the landscape. I really like your diagram of the world chakra system. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that in a moment, where the different continents are actually connected together to form a chakra. And this has to do with this throat chakra idea that you were associating with Europe earlier. And then America has its own chakra. So that there's a chakra there. But are the planets themselves associated with the sort of world chakra? Is that how we interface with these planetary energies? Are these energies that are associated with these planetary motions?
Yeah, I mean, the planets, like the sun, they affect the whole planet as a whole. But where you are in it, you know, as individuals, where we are in any place in the world, will also be affected by that place and how it responds to the conditions being given to the whole planet, which can vary from place to place in the world. But that's getting deep into it.
Right.
It's easier to give a generalization.
Right.
It's always. Yeah, and also if I talk about how I see the chakras, the world, it's there are different layers, different levels of consciousness and energies. So the world is like an onion, really. It has different energy systems on it. So it depends what one is seeing. I always tended to see that the very basic, fundamental underlies everything else. So because, you know, it's like the foundation, everything else can be different, but it's still dependent on that foundation. And so I did years and years of going to different countries and studying history, mythology and things like that, I've said, and sensing the land and so on, and building up my own idea of where the planetary chakras might be. And it wasn't the same as what other people were coming up with, because they were starting to talk about that by then. And the pattern I got didn't really make sense to me. And suddenly, I was given this gift one day, suddenly in a vision. And I was trying to think about all this. I was just suddenly given this absolute vision, spot on, of seeing what in tradition is called the Orphic egg, or the Druidic egg, with the serpent around it.
Right.
Hatching the world egg out, or incubating it, ready for hatching. And I've shown it, you know, the egg was the world, and the dragon around it was like the Earth's Kundalini, planetary Kundalini.
Right.
And I explained to me that, you know, the dragon is a creature, it's a living intelligence, it has its own chakras, and it imprints them on the surface of the Earth in this way. So when I got out my map and so on, I saw it coincided, those chakras of dragon coincided with all my research that I'd done. That's where I'd worked out where the chakras of the world was. And I thought, oh God, what a gift to be given. You know, it suddenly made sense. And yeah, so those are the maps I've drawn and worked out. And then you find the mythology actually tells you also what the chakra is. Like Europe, you know, it's named after the story, the myth of Europa and the bull, which is the simplified version of the Dionysian myth, and to do with bulls that then become swans, you know,
Right.
and in symbolism. And start as a bull, but then we become a swan when we've gone through death and resurrection. And just like Jesus was depicted, he was shown as a swan after his ascension, resurrection, ascension. And yeah, so that's what I show and work with people. Yeah.
In America, where are the key based on your research or even your personal experience, where are some of the key areas where these planetary energies come through and are sort of concentrated? Is it on the East Coast? Is it in the middle of the country or the West, or is it throughout? What have you discovered?
Well, North America, it's a whole chakra, planetary chakra in its own right. It's the brow chakra of the planet. You know, hence it's the command chakra and so on. And so it's no accident that it's the superpower of the planet. You know, just
Right.
it's natural, but you've got to have the right voice speaking to you to create that right idea in the mind. And that right voice comes from the heart. So the heart chakra of the planet is the Indian subcontinent. So it depends on the real wisdom being sounded and picked up in the throat and then fed to the brow chakra, then can see the vision of truth and put it into action in the right way. So that's why Francis Bacon, as Rosicrucian, saw America as so critically important, you know, so they had to prepare the way for the future.
Right. He was instrumental in that.
Yeah. So to take North America in itself, it's a complete landscape in its own right, but it has its, what I call the three pillars, you know, the ancient stories, like we have a left and right and the middle. And always the north is the crown and south is the root in the ideal system. And so you've got Canada representing the head part, and then you've got from throat downwards the rest of North America, and you've got the west coast would be the right-hand side, and the east coast is the left-hand side, and that's how your history is manifested accordingly. You have all the, you know, thinking judgments, most of them all done on the East Coast side. You've got Washington there and so on like that, and in control of everything. And then you've got all the more mystical side on the other coast, together with the Rockies and so on like that. But what you haven't got yet is a good central spine. It's messed up, basically. But once you've got the two sides working together in balance in the right way, in harmony, then you'll start to get the central axis coming up in the right way.
Well, this sort of discussion of America is where I would like to gradually go towards. But let's pick up our sort of narrative, historical narrative, and I want to set the stage for now coming into discussing the Rosicrucians and Francis Bacon more. But before them, sort of in between the beginning of the Christian era and the Rosicrucians, let's say of the 1500s and 1600s, there was the Templars as a sort of intermediary agent. What can you tell us about their significance and how they, and the role they played in ultimately setting the stage for the life of Francis Bacon and his Rosicrucians?
You know, the Templars were important. I mean, they contained a mystery school, but the Templars as a whole was simply a training for young men who got all this stuff, you know, energy. They had to be channeled in the right way. And otherwise they go out fighting wars, fighting each other, which was happening at the time. So it was a training initiatory, if you like, but it depends on each knight as to how far they would get, whether they get into the real esoteric mystery school or not. But the first thing they had to do was offer themselves totally in service, be willing to give up their lives in order to save the lives of others, to protect the truth, and also guard the pilgrimage routes. That was their main route. So all the pilgrims were looked after, because there were a lot of pilgrims being robbed and so on. And so the Templars set up a banking system. They were the first banking system set up by the Templars. So it helped. So pilgrims couldn't be robbed. You know, they just have a bit of paper that's worthless until you got to the, the other end, and then you meet a Templar, go to the Templar bank, as it were, and they give you the money that the bit of paper was worth, an IOU, and which is the check system. Basically, we have, and now it's the credit card. But anyway, the Templars started that off in order to help and protect pilgrims, and that was their original idea. But also to protect Christendom, Christianity, because it was being invaded by the Moors and so on, and others, and they again were fired up by Islam, but like invaders, like those who want to steal other lands, they use religion as an excuse. They pretend we're religious, but they're not really. Islam never taught that. You go out and steal land and kill people and so on. The fundamental Islam doesn't say that at all. But the Moors and so on use that as an excuse to get into Europe. So they took over almost all of the Iberian Peninsula, Hibernian Peninsula, which is now Spain and Portugal. But they were stopped by the Templars from taking over the most northern part, which has now got the main Camino running along it in northern Spain. But they also invaded into what's now Bulgaria and so on. So they were the real threat to taking over the whole of Europe, and that would be the end of Christianity and so on. And you'd just be ruled by dictators, basically. And so the Knights Templars were the main fighting force to try to stop that. Well, their birth was brought into being through the Cistercians, really. So the initial Knight Templars who formed the order most of them were all family connected with Bernard of Clairvaux and so on, and who was a Cistercian. And he was the one who reformed the Cistercian order. And he had this great vision. He was a great soul. He had this vision of, there has to be the monks and so on like that, but then there has to be protectors. You've got to protect the truth. So there has to be a fighting order. And also and they were formed in Jerusalem. They started as monks. They were monks. And they were on what's called Mount Zion, which was the Essene quarter in ancient Jerusalem. They started out there, and then they were given the Temple Mount as their domain. And that's where they were for, 7 years or something like that, the initiatory period of time. And they learned more, trained themselves more. They learned also from Islam, they've contacted people in the true mystery school of Islam to learn from them as well. And then when they were ready, they came back to Europe to build up their order and so on like that. And they were granted permission to only obey the Pope. Kings and so on of Europe didn't have any control over them, but the Pope did. So they were dedicated to the Pope. So it all depended on having a good Pope.
Right. My reading of it is sort of that the Templars was this huge, almost like a machine with many different levels. Maybe a machine is not the right word, but it was a huge organization. And they were responsible, this organization as a whole was responsible for lots of different activities. But one of the things that they did was that while outwardly they had these relationships with the church and served as a protector over certain aspects of the kingdom, of the European sort of Christendom, they were also inwardly preserving, at least at the very elite levels, a mystery school, as you were saying. And they were seeking out also the body of lost knowledge that had been destroyed with this transition age from pagan civilization into this sort of modern Christian era. And for me, that becomes significant in our story with the Rosicrucians, because they were the ones who sort of kept this wisdom tradition, gave it space to exist in Europe during the sort of Dark Ages. And then and it seems like their work was also maybe indirectly or somewhat directly responsible for bringing about the Renaissance in Italy, in terms of the knowledge that they were seeking out and preserving, sort of flowing now into the sort of aristocracy of these Italian city-states. And it's from that point that we can now trace the lineage that ultimately ends up in England with John Dee and then eventually Francis Bacon. So can you talk a little bit about, before we get into the Rosicrucians explicitly, about how the sort of Renaissance and also the wisdom tradition that the Templars were working with, how that just in broad terms helped set the stage for this particular significant period in England with the Rosicrucian order?
Well, the Templars were disbanded, wiped out long before the Renaissance began, really,
Right.
in Florence and so on. But they did hold a mystery school. Now, in Portugal, one of the initial Templars set out to create Portugal as the face of Europe, because it's through the face the truth of the heart is revealed. So they were going to make that a paradise on earth. That was what they set out to do. But to do that, they had to get rid of the Moors, which took quite a bit of time, but they eventually expelled them. And then from the rest of what's now Spain. But Portugal was the key thing. Well, when the Templars were disbanded, the King of Portugal at that time was the Grand Master of the Templar Order in Portugal.
Mm.
I mean, kept quiet about it. So anyway, he said outwardly, "Oh yes, I'll disband the Templars." So he did. So all the possessions they had came into his possession. But he then formed a new order called the Order of Christ and gave them back all their possessions. This was simply the Templar Order renamed the Order of Christ, which still exists to today. And so the mystery school was able to carry on its work. But the mystery school also was in the Christian monasteries and some nunneries too. So there was always people who were part of the inner mysteries. They knew the secrets, but they had to outwardly keep quiet about it. Right. Otherwise they get thrown out the church. So Bernard of Clairvaux was one of those, and all the people behind the Gothic churches, for instance, Gothic cathedrals, they knew these secrets, and that's how Freemasonry started to build up. What's then known as the architect, the chief builder, he was an adept at it all. He had the same knowledge as an abbot might have, right, of the inner truths and so on. And then the Renaissance actually was, with the help of the great Medici, who started off, he became interested in the Platonic side of things, because certain things were being discovered in the East, books and things. And so he was very wealthy, so he paid for people to get these books of Plato and also Hermes Trismegistus, who found the Hermetic writings. And so in Florence, he got that started up with the help of Ficino, who did all the translating, and then was Pico de Mirandello, who joined, and so on. And they brought in the Hebrew Kabbalah into this. The mystery schools had always known the link of all these, but the outer church didn't. Right. But they were able to bring it out more, because Ficino was a monk. He was part of the church in that way. And then with the help of the Medicis, they could make it much more public. And then it took off as the Renaissance and spread northwards right through Europe, and came to its fruition really in England, the English Renaissance at the time of Bacon and Shakespeare.
Right.
and then transmuted into the Great Instauration, which was then taken back from England into Europe and across to America and so on.
Right. Yes. Okay. So this brings us to where I want to go, which is to John Dee and some of the early forefathers in England of the Rosicrucian Society. Because I think, if I remember, I can't remember if it was from your work or Manly Hall's, but one of you discussed this motion of these new teachings that were put together in Italy during the Renaissance, how this gradually moved west into Germany, and then from Germany it moved further west into England. And so the Rosicrucian order was founded in a way as a legacy institution originally in the 1500s, as a legacy of things that were set up as during this Renaissance period. Is that correct?
Yeah, the Renaissance, it took the mystery schools onto another level, if you like. And so everything's about going up degrees, going up levels. So it took one to another level. And so the Renaissance was lifting people who are interested up to this broader level. And so it spread northwards, it spread into France and then into the German states, different German states, of, people forming societies. Usually the societies were networks of people, not lots of people grouped together necessarily, but networks. But there was a lot of communication with each other by letter, messenger, or just visiting them by foot or by horseback and so on. And so they kept in touch with each other. And eventually it was, somebody in the church, Trithemius, the abbot Trithemius, was known as one of the great teachers, Rosicrucian teacher, in charge of a whole network. So he trained Paracelsus and he trained Agrippa. And Agrippa was in Paris and got to group together there and became the leader of that. And then he went on over into England, found like-minded people there. England had its own mystery school. Well, he met them, introduced these Renaissance ideas to them, and that took off in England in the time of Henry VIII. And one of those members was Sir Nicholas Bacon, who became, in Queen Elizabeth's time, became Sir Nicholas Bacon and the Lord Keeper, the Great Seal. Right. And that's when John Dee then came into the picture to be the Queen's astrologer and so on like that. And so he was a member of that mystery school. And then they suddenly, in various reasons, in 1571-72, certain things happened, and they decided to form themselves as a distinct society using the symbol of the Rose and Cross. So they became the Society of the Golden and Rosy Cross, as Michael Meyer explains it. And then suddenly there was this huge supernova in Cassiopeia appeared. And people at that time realized it really is effect, on Earth. That was the British Isles. Cassiopeia projection onto the Earth was the British Isles. And there were astronomers in Europe who worked that out, and Mercator being the main one, he'd made two globes, one of the heavenly sphere and one of the Earth sphere. So if you could superimpose the heavens onto the Earth in that way. And Cassiopeia, the heavenly queen, fell over the British Isles. And England, of all the different countries, the British Isles, had a queen. So that's the queen on Earth, and she's had a baby, she's had a child. She had both a natural child, which was Francis Bacon, in fact, Francis Tudor, but it also represented that work of that society. Yes, that's the go-ahead. We got the heavenly sign. So the work took off in a big way then. And that was the Rosicrucians per se, a society using that name. I didn't mean to say that there were no mystery societies before using the symbol, but they just didn't use it in their name. And then eventually, when James I of Scotland, James VI of Scotland came King of England, James I of England, then it was possible to do even more. And by that time, Francis Bacon was in charge of the whole Rosicrucian fraternity and their links with the mystery schools on the continent. And he turned the Rosicrucian work, which up to then been called the advancement of learning, he turned it into the Great Instauration. And based on, the design, the wisdom design that comes out of the Bible, Genesis, the 6 days of creation, and so on.
So this is an area that I'd like to go more into. I really like how in your work you've highlighted this significant period of the 1570s and the significance of the supernova event, because this event sort of heralded the coming of a great teacher, right? Or a great moment in time. And at that point, Francis Bacon had already been born. But was this the event that brought him into the awareness of this group?
He was only about 13. But he was sent to university at that young age. So the supernova happened when he was first year at university. And it's then he had his great vision of his life's work he'd been called to do. And then he was, when he was 15, he was sent over to France to be further trained then, because people at that time in the society knew who he was. They knew he was a great soul. So he was given a special training. He was sent over to France to meet the mystery school there, and also to, be part of the intelligence network. He was a brilliant cryptologist and so on. So he was used in that way, but he also had to learn the laws and other things like that. And then when that was complete, he was brought back to England when his father died. When Sir Nicholas Bacon died, he had to come back to England. And John Dee was obviously a key person. I think Sir Nicholas Bacon probably is the leader of the Society of the Rosy Cross up to then. But when he died in 1579, then that's probably when John Dee took over the reins. But then John Dee decided to go over to the continent for a few years. So it may be at that point that Bacon, took over the reins. I don't know.
Right.
That's still a moot point for me. But there's nobody else fitting enough to have done the role. But when John Dee came back, of course, he'd lost his position and everything in society. And he ended up near Manchester, really, in the end. But he was still in touch with Francis Bacon, and they worked together as much as they could until John Dee died in about 1608, 1609, something like that.
And
sonnets came out.
this grand vision that Francis Bacon experienced of what his life's work would be, knowing what you know about him and what his career was, what would you say in sort of broad terms? What was this life's work? What was his mission?
That's a big question. His mission really was to bring the world to rebuild its temple of light. And he calls it the temple of light in the human mind. It's in terms that's philosophy. And then he calls his philosophy, though, is active science, which is knowledge of truth. It's not just speculation, it's real knowledge of truth. There's an active science because you've got to put your ideas into action to prove that they're right in order to get that science. So his temple of philosophy, as it's called, or pyramid of philosophy, is actually the temple or pyramid of science, of knowing truth. And he's very clear about it. It needs morality to do that. It can't be done by anybody without good morals. And it has to be as a labor of love. So it's only people who are doing that who would be able to create this new temple,
Right.
and that would replace the old temple, which was in ruins, as it is,
Right.
the state of people's thinking generally, well, certainly of those in charge, is pretty ruinous right now. So his job was to create a new one. But I mean, he foresaw the very difficult time we've been going through the last few hundred years. He saw that it's going to get darker and darker, more materialistic. And he left a prayer saying, praying that he hoped it wouldn't be, he prayed that it wouldn't be too severe. So he realized, the possibility of it being too severe, but he also had this huge hope, and that it wouldn't, humanity would get through it all right, and build this new temple in the human mind through love in action. So It's built not just up there, but also on earth too, heaven on earth, basically. Same as what's talked about in Revelation.
And a big part of his, I mean, there's numerous phases that we'll go into, or components of what he ended up doing to accomplish this purpose. But one of them was to basically to give birth to what we today consider science.
Yeah.
Because before then, science was, I would say, exclusively practiced by philosophers and the mystery schools and people who were associated with that tradition, which is a small number of people. The vast majority only had religion, and that was the only thing that was like the only public institution. But then after Francis Bacon, we see being born this new institution to go alongside religion, which is science. And so can you tell us some about what the way that he envisioned science and some of his main ideas about how it relates to philosophy and religion?
Yeah. Well, he saw that the task was to help everybody in the world reach that higher consciousness and do the right things, not just the few, but to spread it out somehow. And so it had to go beyond just religions, it were. I mean, he revered religion. He revered the Bible and the teachings. He talked about the wisdom that's inspired directly into the human heart, but also spoken by the prophets and recorded in holy books like the Bible and the Quran and so on. So he called that divinity. We need divinity in order to build the philosophy, and philosophy and divinity go together. They like two triangles make the six-pointed star. But he says the actual thing that builds the temple is poetry. Most people don't realize this, but it's poetry in motion, and the highest form of poetry is acting on the stage of the mysteries, because it involves all the arts, all the different arts are involved in that. And so he saw this as the highest way, and that's the way to actually build this new temple of active science. And it went together with celestial phenomena. So when the 1603 Great Conjunction happened, which Paracelsus had foretold, that's when a great light called Elias the Artist would appear to the world. And 1604, it's followed by this supernova in Ophiuchus, which is the 13th sign, and also Mars came to join the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter. So it's all in the same area of the sky, which translated on Earth is very significant to those in England as to what it was. And obviously the person is referring to as a person was Francis Bacon, but as a work, it was referring to the Rosicrucian work.
Right.
So Rosicrucians then took that as the time to make what they prepared in secret very public, which you do it by degrees. Everything goes by degrees. So that's when Bacon started publishing his work, the Advancement of Learning, then Great Illustration, and explaining that. And at the same time, other publications were being done. And also the mystery groups in Europe started up as Rosicrucian groups, from then on, following this great instauration idea and so on. And so it spread that way. And then outwardly to the more general public, in Charles's time, Royal Society was set up in England, and then that was followed up by a similar society in France, and so science for the general public was begun.
Right.
But again, once it goes to the general public, you've only got the few who are the real initiates, and they were Freemasons because they're trained in morality, and others joined in, and then that's the story of science. It's gradually got corrupted, but the science is still done just for good, for people's benefit.
Right.
That is still Bacon's science.
Right.
It requires morally good people to do it.
And it's interesting, you're talking about marrying the right and the left hand sides, and one is sort of analytical thought and the other is more emotional feeling. And Francis Bacon was involved in significant projects on both of these aspects, because on one hand, he did lay out in works like The Advancement of Learning the foundation of the scientific method and how it could be put to use. So he was the father of science in that capacity, but he was also this poet who, facilitated the Shakespeare works, was involved with writing the Rosicrucian manifestos, who had his own publications like The New Atlantis. And so we're talking about somebody here who was involved in almost every aspect of a great cultural and social and intellectual transformation that was taking place in the West. Like you can in a sense look at history as before and after Francis Bacon, because after him, all these new things were born into the world, and things forever change. That's why I like the title of your book, Herald of a New Age. Like he really almost came as a embodiment of an agent of transformation to occur, to bring about these deep-rooted institutional transformations whose legacy are still playing out today. We're still playing out this vision that Francis Bacon, originally experienced. So it's just remarkable. You almost can't even fathom that one person was involved in so many activities. And for me, when you look at the significance of what he was involved in, it seems to me, and I feel the same way about Manly Hall, is that we're not just looking at a great person or a very enlightened person, but somebody who is really seems to have been an agent of and intimately in constant communication with this larger institution that we've been talking about earlier, the mystery schools and the intelligence that is within those schools. Is that how how do you feel about that? Is really Francis Bacon's significance not only as a great person, but as someone who is sort of a perfect example of there existing a deeper level of intelligence and a guiding presence, and he was able to do what he did because of his connection and consciousness with this oversouling idea?
He was a soul who'd from a great spirit, a great overlighting spirit, he was incarnation of that for this particular purpose.
Mm-hmm.
So his life on earth gave him certain gifts and so on, which was needed for that. So he had right from an early age a special training, but it enabled him to get direct contact at a very early age of the higher levels and so on. I mean, his chaplain left a record about him saying he had a great knowledge from books and studies, right, and his experience of things, but his greatest knowledge came direct from God. Instead, even the chaplain saw him as a very, very exalted, high soul. Ben Jonson adulated him, who's a great friend of Francis Bacon, adulated him. And but as Francis Bacon said, he said, great works cannot be done alone. No one person can do great works. So therefore, he collected together a whole lot of other people, all helped him in this. So he was not alone, just like Jesus was not alone.
Right.
Jesus had the 12 apostles, but they were all married, so there were also the wives as well. So he had 24 basically around him. He himself was married, so he had Mary, what's thought to be Mary Magdalene. So they were acting out the whole mystery in that way. But his total number, like Manly Hall, I think, says, came to 120. He had 100, he had a vast Sanhedrin. A normal Sanhedrin is 72 people, but he had a huge one. The greatest one that's known to be able to be handled of 120 people, and all helping. They all helped in their various ways. Otherwise, Jesus couldn't have accomplished his whole Christ mission. Couldn't have done it otherwise. But he did. He was the main guy, of course. Well, same thing with Francis Bacon. He had all these other friends, as he would call them, helping him to enable him to do the work that he actually managed to do.
Right. And I think an important part of his work is that he not only set out the infrastructure for a lot of things that would come in terms of science, in terms of culture and art. And he not only laid out the vision of the new Atlantis and the idea of the Rosicrucians sort of grand theme in their work, which is the transformation of society, or how do they put it? There's a particular way that they put it, but it was like the renovation of human life. But he also very critically was the founder of modern Freemasonry, and through modern Freemasonry, this network was responsible for actually implementing these changes in the coming centuries. So he not only laid out the vision for them and sort of carved out the architecture of these new modes of thinking and new types of cultural expression, but then he literally was the custodian of a network, not only in England, but that branched throughout the continent. And this network, 200 years, 150 years after his death, would bring about the age of revolutions in Europe, but most significantly in America, and set the stage for the American Revolution and the founding of this sort of experimental democratic republic in the West. So can you talk a little bit about the relationship between the Rosicrucian, his involvement with the Rosicrucians, which for me is this more elite group and a more spiritual philosophical group, and then this outer body of Freemasonry, which is more of it's sort of more like the outer courtyard within surrounding this inner temple. But this outer network of Freemasonic branches, which extended all over the place, how this group really became the force that would actually change the world and actually do the work of upending this old order.
Yeah. Well, Freemasonry, the craft Freemasonry, always had its inner group, which would invite people who weren't actually craft Freemasons to join. And the inner group was speculative in the sense of studying the actual wisdom underlying it all, and so on. So there was always that, and there was a good group of that in England at that time, Bacon's time, and he of course became part of that, and so on. Because you had to be, most of those who joined that inner group had very, very good education. They sort of came from the higher classes, really, who were given that good education. And so Bacon took that. He saw, well, to build the temple, Freemasonry has all the right symbols and tools for it, and the wisdom there. And so in King James's time, he took that and made that into what's modern speculative Freemasonry, to make it separate from craft Freemasonry. So in other words, was always that speculative core of craft Freemasonry, but he took that out, as it were, to make it a separate order of its own, because to train people in morality, because he said the only way great installation can be done is through morally trained people. So that was his idea. And then when you get to the next century, when Freemasonry takes off in a very big way, throughout Europe, and the main idea was to try to train some of all the lords, the counts and earls and so on, so that they look after their people better, rather than being dictators, and keeping serfs and so on, but actually train them to treat them as equals within the lodge and give them better roles and treat them properly in the right way. So it was meant to be a huge training school, and some of it was successful and some of it definitely was not successful. That's the way things go. And then you get up to modern times when Freemasonry still exists, and people join the lodge and they are trained. Most of the Freemasons I've come across, they're good, moral people, full of integrity. But whether they get into Rosicrucian consciousness is a different matter. But it's the chance that certain Freemasons can suddenly click into that, and then they work from a higher level all the time, whatever they do. Yeah.
So this sort of sets the stage for us to move over to America, because America was, aside from the scientific and cultural work that he did, Francis Bacon, it seems like the motion of events that he was setting up were destined to have their fruits born in the future, but in America. So there's this idea that Manly Hall talks a lot about, which is like the secret destiny of America and the significance of America. Can you tell us anything about sort of the way Francis Bacon looked at it, and then your own impressions about also factoring in this sort of world chakra system? Like, what is the significance of America, and what was Francis Bacon's ultimate goal for the development of America?
Well, first of all, he like John Dee saw the original Atlantis that Plato talks about, so the one that's destroyed 9000 BC. He saw that as North America and Central America, and he talks about it, how that's how it was, and that's how it was understood. And so that's one thing behind it. The old has been destroyed, so now the new can be built on it. But then the other thing that came into play was through Mercator, who made these two globes, celestial globe and the Earth globe. Cassiopeia fell over the British Isles, but Cygnus the Swan fell over the east side of North America, which was made into Virginia. It's called Virginia. And that's what the first English settlers were set out to establish. Not everybody knew these things, but there's certain leaders knew to do that, to try to set up a colony. Now, the idea of colonies originally was to trade goods with the indigenous people. That was the original idea of colonies, not to go out and steal the land. It was to set up trading posts and so on like that. And but again, the people in power, political power, they always take over and distort these things for their own purposes. And then ordinary people who don't know any better, they got to make a living. So so things happen. But there are a few people who had these good ideas. And in fact, I met somebody who, in my lifetime, I've been very privilege. People have told me things or handed me things not generally known, and I haven't always known what to do with them. But then the right time comes, and then I suddenly think, oh, that's right, that's why I was given it. Well, one of the things, an American researcher, he was a surgeon actually researching cancer and so on, but he was very interested in Bacon and the Rosicrucians and so on. He had a huge library, and somebody who became a friend of mine, another American, she was sent as a journalist to research his life, write about his life, and got interested herself in it all. And so she told me what he had researched and said. And he said, amongst the early settlers who went over were Freemasons.
Mm-hmm.
And they made friends with the elders of the indigenous tribes and found they had the same handshakes. So they recognized each other.
Right.
And then they worked together to set out a whole geometric scheme all down the Appalachians and out into the ocean, to the Bermudas and so on. So I was given a map of this, and they made certain mark certain stones, and they did it together. The colonists, some of the colonists came over together with the elders of the indigenous tribes. So it was done as friendly way,
right,
to lay out this scheme. And I was given this map, and it took me quite a time to realize what it represented. But it was one of the geometries underlying King Solomon's temple.
wow.
So the whole of the Appalachians, or the Virginia part of the Appalachians, was designed as Solomon's temple. And so that's what the inner group, the esoteric group, were aiming for, and passing on their knowledge when they could to others. But it's never been fully carried out, because it just, yeah. But anyway, that's something amazing. And that's to represent Solomon's temple on earth in terms of this unseen geometry, really, reflecting the Cygnus in the sky. And Cygnus in the sky, as you know, represents the ascended initiate, the adept who's ascended to heaven, gone through resurrection, ascension into the higher level of consciousness. So from the bull, he becomes the swan. And so like Jesus was depicted as the swan, flying up to heaven. And the swan is the symbol of the great poet, the poet who sounds the word poetically, with real rhythm and magic and so on. So that was the destiny foreseen for that part of North America. Is yet to fulfill it.
Yeah.
But hopefully one day it'll happen. Yeah.
In this light, I'm curious, what role or what significance does the Oak Island area have? Is that something that you follow? I haven't watched the show, but I'm aware of the mystery involved with that project. For those who don't know, there's basically a long-standing archaeological dig in this remote island. I think it's in Nova Scotia, but it's like the eastern seaboard of Canada, and there is a deliberately created almost like a maze or crypt or something like that conceals something unknown, but there's been a long-standing project to try to uncover it, and there's a lot of keys embedded in the original Rosicrucian publications and some of Francis Bacon works that point to Oak Island. And so is this something that you've tracked, and what is your feeling about this project, what may or may not ultimately be found in this area?
Well, Oak Island is a very special marker, and I mean, whether there's treasure there is another matter, but the real treasure is that it acts as a special marker for certain things to happen. And it's one corner of this great geometry that makes Solomon's temple, and it's a key corner. But it's Nova Scotia, really, which is two places, Nova Scotia, certain great planetary energy lines cross in Nova Scotia, and then go across North America in certain directions. And one of them is from Nova Scotia right over to Los Angeles. And so that was one line, and another line goes down the Appalachians and so on. And over in Europe, they connect to special axes through huge landscape temples. And I mean, I'd have to show you maps to show you what these are, but they are, you know, world circles of energy lines, real energy flowing, and they cross in Nova Scotia. And the navigation over to America from Europe was either done just south of the Pillars of Hercules, as it were, and following the current over, the trade winds go over, take you to Central America. That was one route, but another route was actually following the latitude, 45-degree latitude. So that's over from the south of England, going right over to Nova Scotia. And so they needed a special marker point so that ships, as they sailed over there, would recognize where they'd reached. And that was Oak Island, you know, establishing oaks there instead of all the other indigenous trees around. So it really stood out. And so that was the point for navigation, really.
And I saw this, I mean, I think you might have mentioned this in your work, the idea that there are cryptograms embedded in these original publications of the associated with this Bacon's Rosicrucian group. But there is a documentary by a guy named Peter Amundsen, I think is his name, and he is someone who specializes in decoding these things, and he has definitely found links to certain codes in like the Shakespeare plays, for instance, and some of Bacon's works that literally point towards this area of this Oak Island area. So it does sort of make me wonder if there is, or maybe there once was and it's been destroyed through the process of digging, but there was some stash of important Rosicrucian artifacts or documents associated with this site. I mean, yes, besides the landscape importance of this area.
Yeah, certainly possible, but there was a definite marker set up, and that's the stone cross, which is called Nolan's cross. That was set up in a very special way to show the swan, the idea of the swan, but also underlying that, as Peter Amundsen points out, you've got the idea of a particular form of geometric tree of life hidden there. And he went out and he found the hidden stones that were still buried, you know, and he said, no, that's where they should be. And he dug and he found two of them. And so that's the hidden sign, if you like. That's the library of knowledge already there.
Right. So
in a sense, doesn't need any more things to be buried, but they might have been. You never know.
Right.
But they've been digging there. They haven't found anything else.
Well, it just goes to show you that, I mean, obviously this landscape was this mystery was deliberately set up. It seems by Bacon, or at least his descendants, at a very early point in the, you know, probably before the formal founding of the country. I don't know if there's an exact date on when people think this work was originally done, but it does have something to do with something that I know you have talked about, which is the idea of deliberately presenting a mystery to people so as to draw their mind outwards towards solving it. And in the process of that, then you are actually becoming, in a way, initiated or awakened to a larger theme.
Well, there is what's called the money pit on Oak Island. And so that was clearly set up to be one of those treasure hunts, to get people onto a treasure hunt.
Right.
Hide and seek story, Bacon calls it, or a treasure hunt, because that's, people get it. We're all like a treasure hunt of some sort.
Right.
And then suddenly we find, we're not just hunting out of greed for this. We suddenly find, no, the treasure is something better than that. It's more spiritual and so on, and gives inspiration, gives ideas. and certainly the lady who knew Dr. Strong, who had all this information about Freemasons meeting the indigenous people and so on, Betty McCaig, to prove that she'd worked out things right, she did the alchemical experiments physically to prove that she got it right, and also to show Oak Island people who were digging up Oak Island then that this is what the money pit was originally about. And if you did it in the right way, you would raise this sphere up, inside which would be the treasure sort of thing, and documents and so on. But all the diggers made such a mess of it, and they didn't believe her anyway to start with, so they just carried on making mayhem there. So I think they'll never find anything now. They've destroyed it.
Right.
But having said that, you never know.
Right.
You never know. Miracles can happen still. Yeah.
Well, certainly if there was something of significant found, it would be one of those events that would herald a great sort of moment in time, you know, particularly depending on the nature of what was found. I mean, obviously I don't think it would be treasure, but I think it would be something perhaps relating to the sort of secret work of the Rosicrucians during, you know, Bacon's time. There's another aspect I want to of the Francis Bacon's involvement with America I wanted to ask you about that I don't have a good understanding of, and this is something that Manly Hall's wife, Marie Bauer Hall, was very passionate about. She was very kind of obsessed with this Francis Bacon mystery, and she honed in on this church in Virginia, in Williamsburg. I'm actually from Virginia, and
Bruton Church. Yeah,
Bruton Church. What do you know about this? I've never visited it, even though it's about 45 minutes from where I grew up. But where, what do you know about this, and what do you think is the significance of this site?
Well, it was clearly a very special church. You know, it's a foundation church, and I think the cipher. I mean, it's a genuine cipher, and it does show that there was an underground vault of some sort. You know, probably a concrete vault, similar to what is on Oak Island. So, I mean, they made several attempts to get permission to dig there, I know, and then got it. It was shut down when they thought they'd found it, and so there are some authorities don't want it dug up to change the story, as it were, from their point of view. So that seems to be an answer to that. But at the same time, I think, bless her, Mary Bauer Hall lost it. You know, she started going into all sorts of other things and issues, so she confused the whole picture, really. So I mean, I met her, and Manly was trying to, you know, he knew he was near the end of his life, and so he's trying to support her and give her all that she wanted, help her on this, what she saw as her mission. But I think for some reason or other, I think she blew it. But it's sad, you know, people can get so passionate, it starts to change their thinking a bit. And that's sad. I find it a sad story, actually, that whole thing.
But it's an unresolved issue. I mean, there, like you were saying, it seems like there is something interesting there. There certainly is a connection to Bacon and the Rosicrucians, but it's never been followed through in terms of laying out what is actually the significance of the site, what is there, because it's been blocked. So this remains a ongoing point of interest, I would say.
Yes, I think it is. Yeah, quite agree. Yeah.
I want to ask you a little bit about Washington, D.C. That's where I am right now as I'm speaking to you in Washington, and I spent a lot of my life here. And the infrastructure is amazing that is here, and it's even more amazing once you start going into the sort of sacred geometry and the hidden architecture, and the idea that it was originally designed as a landscape temple. Have you been to Washington, D.C., and with your work in landscape temples, what can you tell us about the layout of the city and what kind of energies or consciousness is it sort of designed to harness? I know it's related to Virgo, the Virgin.
Yeah, well, it was laid out by that French architect, and so used geometry in a very special way. But the central part is a complete chakra system going from the river all the way up to the Senate and House and so on its hill. And then you've got the White House linking to the heart center of that chakra system on one side, and then it's balanced the other side by something else. And no, it's a absolutely wonderful layout. And then you've got all the art galleries and so on in the throat chakra and so on. It's just it's brilliant. It's brilliant. So if you ever get very, very good presidents, they will learn to work very well with that.
Right.
To bring something wonderful into.
Yeah, it seems to me like the city was set up for a purpose that hasn't been realized yet. Like it was set up as a landscape temple, but it's never been used in that way, and it's sort of awaiting. And there's all this interesting symbolism that's embedded around the city too, and it seems like it's awaiting its true purpose, to be revealed, almost as a microcosm of the country itself.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. Yeah.
There's one interesting guy online. I can't remember his name right now, but he's done some interesting work analyzing the sort of significance of certain landscape temples throughout the world and sort of secret architecture involved in cities like London and in New York even, but also a lot in DC. And he did this fascinating thing where he connected a lot of these sacred sites that we're talking about around the area of the of like the capital and things like that. And he says that you can kind of shape them into a sort of pyramidal scheme. And then if you put an eye, like you find in a dollar bill, an eye superimposed on top of the pyramid, like an unfinished pyramid, the eye, like the center of the eye falls over the Scottish Rite sort of temple on 16th Street. And that's a place I've gone several times. They have a beautiful library there, and actually they have a lot of Manly Hall's works in that library. But they have this giant copy of his Secret Teachings of All Ages book. I mean, it's like huge. That's like prominently featured in the library. But this is, in some ways, maybe at the heart of the DC landscape temple. Did you go to the Scottish Rite
no, I didn't.
temple? And
no, I wish I had.
It's an interesting site.
Yeah.
So to finish things off, and I appreciate you giving so much time to the conversation, I want to open up the sort of floor to have you just kind of say whatever you'd like about where you think we are at our current moment in time and what you see. I mean, we talked a little bit about this already, but also where you see the coming time period that we're moving into. What can we expect of this period? As we were saying, we're in a period of a lot of darkness, but that's maybe prefacing awakening or light coming. What are your overall thoughts on this time period, and what maybe for people who are listening and experiencing the hardship and the darkness of the moment, what kind of encouragement, if you have any, to give them about where we are in this point and any larger themes that are playing themselves out through this trying period?
Well, what comes to my mind immediately to help explain it is the idea of the instauration. We are about to instaurate a new temple, but we got ruins, or ruining is going on around us. So it's just like in the story, the Jews were released from captivity, but from Babylon, and they came back to rebuild the temple and get that right. So they've had a pretty awful time, but they've got through it and go back. The first thing you got to do is find the hidden wisdom in the old,
Right.
draw out the wisdom of the old, and then that can be added to the wisdom you already have, new wisdom you've given, to build the new temple. And then you'll have and Zerubbabel, you know, that means the great word, whereas Solomon means the temple of peace, the peace, the temple of peace, temple of the word. The temple of the peace is like the first temple. The second temple, you actually sounds the word, you know, so it's the greater temple. And I think that's the future. Those who suddenly become going to be builders of this new temple, they'll suddenly think, yes, I'm called to do this.
Right.
And they'll draw out the wisdom from the old, including from the ground. You know, the wisdom is in nature, in the ground. They'll draw out all this new things, just like science is discovering new things all the time. But to use it for the good purpose. And we'll build this new temple in the human mind through love's labors, you know, instead of love's labors being lost, we'll suddenly do it with labor of love. And you can see this happening all over the world. Though amongst huge difficulties, people are actually looking after each other, protecting each other, helping each other, and trying to stop being overwhelmed by what one could call evil, you know, usually from greed or something like that, or mistaken thinking. But usually, you know, it's usually comes from thinking, well, I know best, you know nothing, I'm going to control you, and I'm going to steal your things. And it's the old problem of humanity, you know, for thousands of years. But there are people, I mean, I think there are millions of people. I mean, you know, when you go into higher consciousness, it's possible to take your consciousness out beyond the earth and look back at it. You know, some people call it out of body experience, but it's anyway. I see all these wonderful sparks of light, stars of light around the world. There's millions of them, and they're all good people, shining hearts, loving hearts, all over the world. And so it will grow, it'll increase. And eventually they'll gain the power to, you know, be the leaders and so on of society generally.
You see 2020 as being maybe the marker of a shift in tide, or do you still feel like there is a significant moment of like reckoning that is still to come before like the upward trajectory of the cycle commences?
No, 2020 was a key time. I was alerted to this a few years beforehand and told this is when it really begins. And for the next 12 years, starting in 2020, it will be key to it, but it's a Jupiter cycle, and Jupiter is associated with benevolence and mercy and so on. I mean, it's also Saturn, but Saturn takes much longer.
Right.
But Jupiter, 12-year Jupiter cycle, and then they showed me how it will function. So when 2020 happened and the COVID problem happened, it was just spot on what I'd been shown. And so there's always a creative sign and responsive sign. The creative sign will set up something that people then respond to, and something will happen to them to test them. And the first thing the creative sign 2020 was Taurus, and the responsive sign is Scorpio, which is the root chakra, and that's to do with existence. You know, I want to survive, I want to exist. So what happens? We get the COVID suddenly coming out, threatening everybody's existence,
right?
And they had to work very hard to find ways to overcome that and look after people. You know, so it brought out a lot of love at the same time as sorrow and so on. and also a challenge, like in England, it's a challenge to the politicians, which they still have going on, to look after things that people need, depend upon, which is for their health, is hospitals and so on, and the whole proper medical system, because everyone needs that, and that's to do with the root chakra. And then 2021 was to do with the sacral chakra, and so it's gone up. Now it's the heart chakra being tested. So you'll get strong egos, people who want to be lions, you know, of everything, but also bring out the good-heartedness in people very much. And so it'll go on.
So you're saying that when people look back 50 years from now or 100 years from now, they'll see 2020 to 2032 as representing a continuum of activity that'll come together in a way?
Yeah.
And where do you see that 2032 period? What do you see that point as representing once that is reached?
Well, if we all survive, which I jolly well hope most of us will, or at least you'll survive. I got to struggle to make it. Then I think we'll have broken through and be able to make a really great world. But there's a lot of very serious tests to get through, yes, including looking after all this pollution of the earth and changing the planetary climate and so on. Because if that's not dealt with very soon, there will be nature will wipe us out.
Right.
So that's, you know, it's very critical. We're in a very critical stage, but crises can lead to breakthroughs.
Right.
You know, breakdown, breakthrough, as it were. But we have to make the effort for that to happen.
So in a way, you're kind of intimating that this period will be one of continual challenges, perhaps continual crises, but building up to something. There's a meaning and purpose behind these events.
Yes, absolutely. And I believe the great prophets too, and they've all said there will be a golden age. Doesn't say how many there will be for.
Right.
How many of us will still survive, but
right.
There will be a golden age. And anyway, you know, the soul itself's immortal. You know, life goes on and on and on. It's only the outer form that changes. So, you know, we'll die, leave our mortal self, the mortal body, but then we'll incarnate in a new way. So it's not the end for any soul. Any soul's not the end. It'll go on. Yeah.
You know, in a way, I look at. I think this might have been something I wrote in an article or two I recently published, or maybe it's the one I'm writing now. They all blend together. But there's this idea that before you move into a new age or a new cycle, you have to shed baggage or attachments from the previous cycle. And in a way, this period of tumult and crises that you're talking about, 2020, 2032, but also what we've been going through continuously in the past. But these, in a way, might represent a shedding of karma, perhaps, or burning out of karma from the past to liberate as part of this cleansing process that you were saying is part of the lower mysteries, but you sort of a cleansing of the candidate, the initiate, the neophyte, the collective human being, into now moving into a newer stage of their progress. Is that a way that makes sense to you? That kind of framing?
I mean, it's bad karma, you mean, isn't it? Because there's also good karma.
Right.
Karma depends on the work we do.
Right.
But if we do it as a yoga, you know, aiming for union with the divine, then it's we make mistakes. You know, everyone. You know, we learn by making mistakes.
Yes.
But the thing is to try to put mistakes right, and so on. So there's bad karma, which is simply from mistakes, but then there's the bad karma, which is real evil.
Right.
And we have to get rid of that or transform it into something better. Yeah.
All right, Peter. Well, thank you very much. I'll wrap things up for now, but it was wonderful talking with you. I hope we get a chance to meet in person one day. I would love to travel over to England and maybe go on one of these sort of excursions and pilgrimages that you organize. That would be wonderful. But until then, thank you so much for talking with me today. I really enjoyed this.
Well, thank you, Alex, very much. Yeah.
Okay. Well, have a great day. Thank you and God bless.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.